Put that phone down right now or I'll have you removed from my aircraft." The words exploded through the first-class cabin like a thunderclap, but they were just the beginning of what would become the most catastrophic, career-ending mistake in aviation history. Because the woman sitting calmly in seat 1A, the one Captain Brett Harrison was screaming at, wasn't just another passenger. She owned the entire airline, and in the next 20 minutes, she would demonstrate exactly what real power looked like. Before we dive into this incredible story, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been in a situation where someone with a uniform thought they could intimidate you simply because of their position? Drop a comment below and let us know. And if this story moves you even a little, smash that like button and subscribe to our channel. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens when quiet dignity meets explosive arrogance at 35,000 feet. Denver International Airport was drowning under the season's worst November blizzard. Outside the thick glass walls of Gate C-22, snow whipped across the tarmac in violent sheets that made the massive aircraft look like toys in a child's snow globe. Inside the terminal, the atmosphere was just as turbulent. Flight 2156 to Miami had been delayed for nearly 4 hours, and the boarding area buzzed with the frustrated energy of 300 stranded passengers who had places to be, people to see, and deals to close. Dr. Zara Williams sat near the window, her back straight, and her dark eyes focused on the tablet balanced on her crossed legs. At 48, she possessed the kind of quiet elegance that didn't need to announce itself to command attention. Her natural hair was pulled back in a sleek bun, and she wore no jewelry except for a simple Patek Philippe watch that probably cost more than most people earned in a year. To the casual observer, she looked like any other exhausted business traveler in expensive clothes, trying to salvage a day that had gone completely sideways. To anyone who looked more carefully, she radiated the unmistakable confidence of a woman who had spent decades turning obstacles into stepping stones and never had time for other people's nonsense. She was running on maybe 6 hours of sleep across the past 3 days. The emergency acquisition meeting in London had stretched through 72 sleepless hours of negotiations with European Union regulators who seemed determined to throw last-minute complications into her company's biggest merger. $2.8 billion hung in the balance along with the jobs of nearly 3,000 employees across 2 continents. The weather had trapped her in Denver when she should have been back in her Miami headquarters coordinating with her team to address concerns from Brussels about market concentration and environmental impact assessments. Every hour of delay meant millions of dollars in potential complications, regulatory hurdles that could derail 18 months of careful planning. Dr. Williams had deliberately chosen to fly commercial instead of taking her company's private jet. As CEO of Horizon Aviation Holdings, she believed in experiencing her operations from the customer's perspective. Sometimes the best intelligence about your business came from walking in your customers' shoes, hearing their complaints, witnessing their frustrations firsthand. Today, she was certainly getting a full dose of the customer experience. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are finally ready to begin boarding for Flight 2156, announced Elena Martinez, her voice crackling through the gate area speakers. Elena was 35 years old and sounded as frazzled as she looked after dealing with increasingly angry passengers for the better part of 4 hours. Her uniform was wrinkled. Her hair was escaping from its ponytail, and she had that hollow-eyed expression that comes from explaining the same weather delays over and over to people who seemed to think she personally controlled the storm. The crowd surged forward like water through a broken dam. Dr. Williams remained seated, watching the chaos with the patient amusement of someone who had learned long ago that rushing rarely improved anything. When Elena called for first-class passengers and elite status members, Dr. Williams gathered her leather tote bag and walked calmly toward the gate. "First class?" Elena asked, scanning the boarding pass that was printed on heavy cardstock rather than displayed on a phone screen. Her eyes caught on the name and the VIP notation that appeared in the computer system. She didn't know why this particular passenger was flagged as important, but the airline's reservation system never lied about these things. There were different levels of VIP status, and Dr. Z. Williams was clearly at the top of whatever hierarchy the computer recognized. Seat 1. A Dr. Williams confirmed with a slight smile that was more professional courtesy than warmth. "Have a wonderful flight, Dr. Williams," Elena said, though something in her gut told her that wonderful was probably not going to describe the next few hours. Captain Brett Harrison stood in the cockpit of the Boeing 777, staring out at the swirling snow with the kind of bitter frustration that had been eating at him for months. At 54, he was a man who had spent the better part of 3 decades believing that respect came automatically with the 4 gold stripes on his uniform. He had been wrong about a lot of things lately, but that particular delusion was proving the hardest to shake. His platinum blonde hair was still thick and carefully styled. His jaw was still strong, and his uniform was pressed to military perfection. From the outside, he looked like Central Casting's idea of what an airline captain should be: tall, authoritative, commanding. The problem was that the authority he thought came with the uniform had been steadily eroding, and Brett Harrison was not handling the change gracefully. Last month's performance review had been a masterclass in professional humiliation. His supervisor, a woman 15 years younger than him named Patricia Moore, had sat across from him in a sterile conference room and used words like problematic and concerning to describe his leadership style. She talked about passenger complaints, crew member feedback, and something she called toxic management patterns, as if she were discussing a virus that needed to be contained. Experience without adaptability is just stubbornness. "Captain Harrison," she had said, her voice maddeningly calm and professional. "We need leaders who inspire confidence through competence, not compliance through intimidation." They had put him on a performance improvement plan. 6 months to change his approach to crew management and passenger interaction, or face reassignment to a desk job that would effectively end his flying career. At 54, starting over somewhere else wasn't really an option, especially not with his personal finances in complete freefall. His divorce from Linda was bleeding him dry in the most expensive possible way. Her lawyer was a shark in an Armani suit who seemed to take personal pleasure in documenting every asset, every retirement account, every stock option that Brett had accumulated over his career. The woman who had once promised to love him in sickness and in health was now demanding half of everything he had worked for, including the house, the boat, and a chunk of his airline pension that wouldn't vest for another 6 years. Brett needed this job. He needed the $425,000 salary, the health insurance, the travel benefits, and the illusion that he was still important to someone somewhere. He couldn't afford any more black marks on his record, any more passenger complaints, any more crew members running to human resources with stories about his leadership style, which made what was about to happen so utterly catastrophically stupid. First Officer Amy Chen sat in the right seat, methodically working through pre-flight checklists with the kind of focused precision that had gotten her promoted faster than any other pilot in her training class. At 26, she was young enough to represent everything that frustrated Brett about the modern airline industry. She had grown up with diversity initiatives and sensitivity training. She questioned procedures that had worked perfectly well for decades, and she had the audacity to expect to be treated as an equal rather than a subordinate who should be grateful for the opportunity to learn from her betters. Amy had been flying with Captain Harrison for 3 months, long enough to recognize the warning signs when his mood was turning dark. The rigid posture, the clipped responses to routine communications, the way his jaw muscles twitched when he was working himself up to one of his legendary explosions. She had learned to stay quiet during these episodes, to focus on her instruments and avoid eye contact until the storm passed. Rosa Valdez was checking the first-class galley one more time, making sure the coffee was fresh and the service items were properly stocked. At 32, she was a single mother from Phoenix who had been working for various airlines for 8 years. She loved the travel, the flexibility, and the chance to meet interesting people from around the world. What she didn't love was working flights with Captain Harrison, who had a reputation among the flight attendants for being demanding, unpredictable, and quick to write people up for infractions that other captains would ignore. 6 months ago, Rosa had watched Harrison explode at a passenger who had accidentally spilled coffee during turbulence. The man was elderly. His hands shook slightly, and the spill was clearly accidental. Harrison had demanded that airport security remove the passenger for assaulting crew members, and when Rosa tried to suggest that it was just an accident, Harrison had turned his fury on her. "Are you questioning my judgment, Valdez?" he had hissed. "Are you telling me how to handle security threats on my aircraft?" Rosa had backed down immediately. She couldn't afford to lose this job, not with an 8-year-old son who depended on her health insurance and steady income. But the passenger had been removed anyway, questioned by security for 2 hours before being cleared to catch a later flight. By then, he had missed his daughter's wedding. Now, Rosa could feel that same tension building as she watched Captain Harrison emerge from the cockpit, with that particular expression she had learned to fear. In seat 3, B8-year-old Lily Patel was traveling alone for the first time, flying from Denver to Miami to spend Thanksgiving with her grandmother. She was a bright, observant child who had been taught to be polite to adults and to ask questions when she didn't understand something. The airline escort assigned to help her was a cheerful woman named Janet, who had been delayed by the same weather that was affecting everyone else. Lily had been watching the adults around her with the kind of innocent curiosity that children bring to everything. She noticed that the lady in seat 1A seemed very focused on her work, that the flight attendant looked worried about something, and that the man in the pilot uniform who had just walked out of the front of the airplane looked angry about something. Dr. Williams settled into seat 1A with the practiced efficiency of someone who spent her life in airports and airplane cabins. The leather was soft, the legroom was generous, and the seat had all the power outlets and connectivity features she needed to stay productive during the flight. She placed her bag in the overhead bin, fastened her seatbelt, and immediately pulled out her phone to call Arthur Penn, her chief financial officer, who was waiting for her green light on the merger from his office in London. "Arthur," she said quietly into the phone, "tell me the Brussels regulators haven't found any new reasons to complicate our lives in the past 4 hours." The conversation was critical. The European Union's competition authority had raised concerns about market concentration in the regional aviation sector. Environmental groups were pressuring lawmakers about the potential impact of the merger on flight frequencies and carbon emissions. Political pressure was mounting from 3 different directions, and if this deal collapsed, 18 months of work would disappear, along with the best opportunity her company would have to compete globally with the industry giants. She needed 30 minutes of uninterrupted time to walk through the regulatory responses with Arthur to make sure their legal team in Brussels had addressed every concern, and to coordinate the final documentation that would either save or kill the biggest deal in her company's history. What she didn't need was interruption from airline crew members who were having a bad day. Captain Brett Harrison emerged from the cockpit and immediately zeroed in on the woman in seat 1A, who was talking on her phone while he was trying to coordinate with ground control about de-icing procedures. The sound of her voice, calm and professional and completely ignoring his presence, hit him like fingernails on a chalkboard. This was his aircraft, his domain, and passengers who thought they could conduct business meetings during his safety briefing were about to learn about respect and authority. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying the kind of sharp authority that had worked for him in the past. "You need to end that call." Dr. Williams glanced up from her phone and held up one perfectly manicured finger in the universal gesture for 1 minute, please. She continued her conversation with Arthur about regulatory timelines and documentation requirements, speaking in the kind of measured professional tone that indicated she was dealing with complex, time-sensitive business matters. That single gesture, that moment of being politely asked to wait while she finished a sentence, was the match that lit Captain Brett Harrison's very short fuse. "Ma'am," he said, stepping closer to her seat, his voice rising slightly. "I need you to put the phone away now. We are preparing for departure." Dr. Williams looked out her window at the jet bridge, which was still attached to the aircraft. The main cabin door was standing wide open. Passengers were still filing past them toward the economy section, dragging rolling suitcases and searching for overhead bin space. Ground crews were still working around the aircraft, loading bags and conducting the long list of pre-departure procedures that would take another 20 minutes at minimum. "Arthur, hold that thought," she said into the phone, then looked up at Captain Harrison with polite curiosity. "Captain, the door is still open. Passengers are still boarding, and I'm well within FAA regulations to finish this call. It concerns business that frankly helps pay for jet fuel." It was a throwaway comment, the kind of casual reference to corporate expenses that executives make without thinking. But Brett Harrison heard something else entirely. He heard condescension, superiority, a passenger who thought she could lecture him about regulations and procedures on his own aircraft. "I don't care who you think you are." He snapped his face, flushing pink around the edges. "On my aircraft, when I speak, you listen. Put the phone away. Now." The first-class cabin, which had been filled with the quiet murmur of conversations and the rustle of passengers getting settled, went completely silent. Rosa Valdez, who had been checking seatbelts in the back rows, froze in place. She had seen Captain Harrison lose his temper before, but never this quickly. Never over something so trivial. Trevor Walsh, a tech consultant sitting in seat 4C, looked up from his laptop. He had been documenting the weather delays for his travel blog, but this confrontation was suddenly much more interesting than flight schedules and meteorology. He had already noticed Captain Harrison yelling at ground crew through the terminal windows. The man clearly had anger management issues, and now he was picking a fight with a passenger who was sitting quietly and bothering absolutely no one. Trevor reached for his phone and opened the camera app. Something told him he was about to witness something worth recording. In seat 3B, Lily Patel watched the interaction with the kind of innocent concern that children bring to adult conflicts they don't understand. She tugged on Janet's sleeve and whispered, "Why is the pilot upset with the nice lady?" She wasn't being loud. Janet shushed her gently, but Lily's question hung in the air with the kind of moral clarity that only children can provide. Why was the pilot upset? What had the nice lady done wrong? Dr. Williams looked at Captain Harrison for a long moment. She didn't blink. She didn't fidget with her phone or her papers. She simply studied this man who was trying to intimidate her and made a calculation about how much of her valuable time and energy this situation was worth. Slowly, deliberately, she raised the phone back to her ear. "Arthur," she said, never breaking eye contact with the captain. "I'm going to have to call you back. It seems our pilot is having some kind of emotional episode." She tapped the screen to end the call and placed the phone in her lap, then looked up at Captain Harrison with the kind of calm composure that comes from decades of dealing with difficult men who confused volume with authority. The silence that followed was heavy enough to feel in your chest. Rosa's breath caught in her throat. Trevor's finger hovered over the record button on his phone. Even Lily seemed to sense that something important was happening, something that would change the dynamic of their entire flight. Emotional episode. Captain Harrison repeated his voice, dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Dr. Williams adjusted her cashmere sweater and crossed her legs, settling back in her seat with the kind of relaxed confidence that suggested she was exactly where she belonged. "I assume you're the pilot," she said. "Though currently you're behaving more like airport security having a very public breakdown." That was the moment when Captain Brett Harrison's last thread of self-control snapped completely. What happened next would be replayed on social media millions of times, analyzed by crisis management experts and studied in business schools as a perfect example of how authority without accountability becomes tyranny in a uniform. Captain Harrison's hands slowly curled into fists at his sides. His face progressed from pink to deep red to an alarming shade of purple that suggested his blood pressure had reached levels that probably required medical intervention. The vein at his left temple began pulsing visibly, and his breathing became shallow and rapid. "Nobody," he said, his voice shaking with barely contained rage. "Nobody disrespects me on my aircraft. Do you understand that I am the captain of this plane? My word is law up here. When I tell you to put the phone away, you put it away. When I tell you to sit quietly, you sit quietly. And when I tell you that your attitude is disrupting my crew, that's exactly what's happening." Dr. Williams reached for the crystal water glass that Rosa had placed on her armrest earlier. She took a slow, deliberate sip, never breaking eye contact with the captain. When she spoke, her voice was level and clear, carrying just enough volume for the surrounding passengers to hear every word. "My attitude is perfectly fine, Captain. I'm sitting quietly in my assigned seat. I ended my call when you requested it. I haven't raised my voice or left my seat or bothered anyone around me. The only person creating a disturbance in this cabin is standing right in front of me." "Don't get smart with me," Harrison snarled, pointing a finger inches from her face. "I can have you removed from this aircraft. Do you understand that I can snap my fingers and airport security will drag you off this plane in handcuffs?" "For what?" Dr. Williams asked, taking another sip of water. "For hurting your ego." That question, delivered with such calm precision, was the final straw that broke Captain Harrison's professional composure completely. His chest started heaving like he had just run a marathon. His hands were shaking with rage. 26 years of accumulated frustration, disappointment, failed expectations, and wounded pride erupted all at once like a pressure cooker with a broken safety valve. "Rosa," he roared, spinning toward the galley where the flight attendant was trying to make herself invisible. "Get over here, now!" Rosa jumped like she had been struck by lightning. "Yes, Captain," she squeaked, her voice barely audible above the sound of her own heartbeat. "This passenger," Harrison announced, his voice loud enough to carry well into the economy cabin, "is being belligerent. She's refusing to follow crew instructions. She's exhibiting hostile behavior that threatens flight safety. I want her removed from the manifest immediately." Rosa's eyes darted between Captain Harrison's fury-contorted face and Dr. Williams's calm composure. She saw a well-dressed woman sitting quietly in first class, drinking water, causing absolutely no disturbance whatsoever. She also saw a veteran pilot who looked like he was about to have a stroke or a heart attack or both. The moral choice was obvious. The practical choice was impossible. Rosa had bills to pay and a son to feed, and Captain Harrison controlled her performance evaluations, her schedule assignments, and her future with the airline. "Captain," she whispered, trying desperately to defuse a situation that was spiraling completely out of control. "Maybe we could just let this go. We're already behind schedule, and she seems perfectly calm now." "I gave you a direct order," Harrison shouted. The sound echoed off the cabin walls like a gunshot. "Get the gate agent. Get security. Get whoever you need to get this disruptive passenger off my aircraft. Now." Throughout the airplane, conversation stopped mid-sentence. A mother in economy automatically pulled her toddler closer to her chest. Business travelers looked up from their phones and laptops. The elderly gentleman in seat 2B stopped reading his newspaper. Even the passengers who couldn't see what was happening could hear the captain's voice, could sense the tension radiating from the first-class cabin like heat from a fire. Trevor Walsh, still recording from seat 4, felt his heart rate spike as he watched this complete meltdown unfold in real time. This was insane. The captain was completely out of control, and the passenger had done literally nothing wrong except maintain her dignity in the face of aggressive unprofessionalism. Rosa's face was pale as paper. Her hands trembled as she reached for the galley phone to call the gate agent. She knew this was wrong. She could see that this was wrong, but she also knew what happened to crew members who defied Captain Harrison's direct orders. She had watched him destroy other people's careers over smaller infractions than this. "I'm sorry," she whispered to Dr. Williams as she lifted the handset. "I'm so sorry." Dr. Williams set down her water glass with deliberate care. She reached into her leather tote bag and pulled out a slim executive notebook, the kind that senior executives use for important meetings when they need to document critical information. She uncapped an expensive fountain pen and looked up at Captain Harrison with perfectly calm eyes. "What is your full name, Captain?" she asked. Harrison laughed, and it was a harsh, barking sound with absolutely no humor in it. "Oh, you're going to file a complaint. You think corporate cares what someone like you thinks about airline operations? I've been with this company for 26 years. I'm a check airman. I train other pilots. I'm untouchable." "Everyone has a name," Dr. Williams said softly, her pen poised above the page. "I see Harrison on your name tag. First name, middle initial. Captain Brett Harrison," he sneered, straightening his uniform jacket with aggressive pride. "Spell it right when you write your little complaint letter. You'll need it for the apology you're going to send me when you want to get off the no-fly list." Lily Patel watched this exchange with the kind of wide-eyed fascination that children bring to adult behavior they don't understand. She tugged on Janet's sleeve again and whispered, "The pilot is being mean to the nice lady. My mommy says grown-ups should use inside voices on airplanes." Janet tried to shush her, but several passengers nearby heard the comment and began exchanging glances. Out of the mouths of babes, as the saying goes. If an 8-year-old could recognize that the captain's behavior was inappropriate, what did that say about the adults who were just sitting there watching it happen? Dr. Williams wrote something in her notebook, her handwriting flowing and precise. Captain Harrison couldn't see what she was writing, but the careful way she formed each letter made his stomach clench with sudden, inexplicable unease. The moment that Dr. Williams capped her pen and closed her notebook. Something shifted in the cabin atmosphere. It was subtle, but everyone could feel it. The kind of change in air pressure that happens before a storm breaks when the wind stops and the birds go silent, and you know that something big is about to happen. Captain Harrison was still riding the adrenaline high of his authority display, still convinced that he had successfully put an uppity passenger in her place. He didn't recognize the calm that had settled over Dr. Williams as the kind of dangerous quiet that comes from a decision being made, a line being drawn, and consequences being accepted. "Are you threatening me?" Harrison demanded, waving his arms dramatically. "Did everyone hear that? She just threatened the captain of a commercial aircraft? That's a federal offense." Dr. Williams didn't respond immediately. She slipped the notebook back into her bag with the same careful precision she brought to everything else. When she finally looked up at him, her dark eyes held something that Captain Harrison's ego wouldn't let him recognize as pity. "I haven't threatened anyone, Captain, but I am curious about something." She paused, letting the question hang in the air. "In your 26 years of flying, how many passengers have you had removed for sitting quietly and conducting business calls during boarding?" The question was asked in such a reasonable tone that it took Harrison a moment to realize it was designed to expose the absurdity of his position. This isn't about," he stammered, then caught himself. "You were being disruptive. You were refusing crew instructions." "I ended my call when you asked," Dr. Williams replied. "I've remained in my seat. I've spoken quietly and politely. The only disruption in this cabin is coming from you." Trevor Walsh's phone captured every word of this exchange. His video was already being uploaded to multiple social media platforms, and the view count was climbing rapidly as people shared what they were calling the most epic airline meltdown ever recorded. In seat 3, B, Lily Patel was becoming increasingly distressed by what she was witnessing. She had been taught that adults should treat each other with respect, that people should use their inside voices in public places, and that someone wearing a uniform should be helpful, not scary. Janet, she whispered to her escort. Why is the pilot yelling? Did the nice lady do something bad? Janet, who had been working as an unaccompanied minor escort for 12 years, had never seen anything like this situation. No, sweetheart, she whispered back. The lady didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes grown-ups make poor choices when they're having a bad day, but he's supposed to be the captain. Lily said, her voice carrying that particular childhood confusion that comes from watching adults behave worse than children. My daddy says people in charge should set a good example. Her words carried further than she intended, and several passengers nearby nodded in agreement. The contrast was stark and obvious to anyone paying attention. The passenger was calm, dignified, and reasonable. The captain was red-faced, shouting, and increasingly incoherent. Rosa Valdez was still standing by the galley phone, her hand frozen on the handset. She could see that calling security would be wrong, that Captain Harrison was completely out of line, but she also knew that her job depended on following his orders. She had watched him destroy other crew members' careers over much smaller acts of what he considered insubordination. But she was also watching Dr. Williams handle this situation with a kind of grace under pressure that reminded Rosa of her own grandmother, a woman who had faced discrimination and harassment with dignity intact. There was something about this passenger that suggested she wasn't as powerless as Captain Harrison assumed. Captain Rosa said quietly, trying one more time to de-escalate, "Maybe we could just finish boarding and discuss this later. The weather is getting worse, and we really need to get these passengers to Miami." Harrison spun around to face her, his face contorting with fresh rage. "Are you questioning my judgment, Valdez? Are you telling me how to handle security threats on my aircraft?" The words were almost identical to what he had said to her 6 months earlier, and Rosa felt the same familiar fear creep up her spine. But this time, something was different. This time, she could see that other people were watching, recording, documenting what was happening. "No, Captain," she said, but her voice was stronger than it had been before. "I'm just suggesting that maybe this passenger isn't actually a security threat." "I'll decide what constitutes a threat on my aircraft," Harrison snapped. "Now make the call, or I'll find someone who will follow orders without second-guessing my authority." Dr. Williams watched this exchange with growing interest. She was beginning to understand the power dynamic that allowed men like Captain Harrison to operate with impunity. Crew members were trapped between their professional obligations and their economic survival. They knew right from wrong, but they couldn't afford to act on that knowledge. That was about to change. As Rosa reluctantly dialed the gate agent, Dr. Williams made a decision that would alter the trajectory of everyone's life on that aircraft. She pulled out her phone again, but this time she wasn't calling her CFO in London. This time she was calling the one person who could end Captain Brett Harrison's career with a single word. "This is Sarah Chen," came the crisp voice through Dr. Williams' phone. Sarah was the vice president of operations for Horizon Aviation Holdings, a woman who had worked her way up from flight attendant to the executive suite through a combination of brilliant operational instincts and an absolute intolerance for nonsense from anyone at any level of the company. Sarah, Dr. Williams said quietly, "I need you on the next flight to Denver. Bring the legal team and the termination paperwork. We have a situation." Captain Harrison, who had been pacing in front of her seat like a caged animal, stopped mid-stride. Something about her tone, the casual way she mentioned legal teams and termination paperwork, penetrated his rage-clouded thinking, but his ego wouldn't let him consider the possibility that this passenger might actually have the kind of power she was implying. "Who do you think you're calling?" he demanded. "Are you trying to get me in trouble with my supervisor? Let me save you some time, lady. I've got 26 years with this company. My performance record speaks for itself. One complaint from a difficult passenger isn't going to hurt me." Dr. Williams held up one finger again, the same gesture that had started this entire confrontation. "Sarah, the captain's name is Brett Harrison. Employee ID number—" "Hold on." She looked up at Harrison with polite curiosity. "What's your employee identification number?" Captain Harrison's laugh was getting more forced and hollow with each exchange. "I'm not giving you my employee ID. Are you insane? You think I'm going to help you file a complaint against myself?" "That's fine," Dr. Williams said into the phone. "Sarah, just look up. Captain Brett Harrison, platinum blonde, approximately 54 years old, flying Route 2156 today. Cross-reference with any existing performance issues or passenger complaints." She paused, listening to something on the other end. "Yes, I'm sure you'll find quite a few." The certainty in her voice, the casual way she discussed accessing company personnel records, was starting to create cracks in Harrison's confidence. But he had gone too far to back down, now committed too much of his professional reputation to this confrontation to simply walk away. "You people," he said, and the words came out before his brain could stop them, "think you can buy your way into respect. Think your money makes you special. But up here in this cabin, I'm the authority. Your credit card doesn't mean anything at 35,000 feet. The cabin went completely silent. Even the engine noise seemed to fade. Trevor Walsh's camera captured every word clearly. Rosa dropped the phone handset entirely. First Officer Amy Chen, who had been trying to stay invisible in the cockpit, closed her eyes and knew that her captain had just crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. "You people," Dr. Williams repeated slowly, her voice carrying a dangerous edge that hadn't been there before. She was no longer drinking water, no longer writing in her notebook. She was focused entirely on Captain Harrison with the kind of laser attention that very successful people bring to problems that need solving. "That's an interesting choice of words, Captain. Very revealing." Harrison's brain finally caught up to his mouth. He realized what he had just said, how it sounded, what it implied about his true feelings and motivations. But instead of apologizing, instead of backing down and trying to salvage the situation, he doubled down with the kind of stubborn arrogance that had been destroying his relationships for years. "Don't try to twist my words," he said. "I meant entitled passengers, rich people who think they can disrespect working folks like me. I meant people who buy first-class tickets and think that makes them better than the crew." "I haven't disrespected anyone," Dr. Williams said, writing something new in her notebook. "But you've certainly revealed your perspective on respect authority and exactly which passengers you think deserve dignity." A businessman in seat 4A stood up. He was wearing an expensive suit and had the kind of confident bearing that suggested he had been in his share of boardrooms and difficult negotiations. "Hey, buddy," he said to Harrison, his voice calm but firm. "She didn't threaten you. She's been sitting there quietly this entire time. You're the one yelling and making a scene." Harrison spun around like a tornado, changing direction. "Sit down, or you're off this flight too," he shouted. "I will not be lectured by passengers who think a first-class ticket gives them authority over airline operations." The businessman sat down, shaking his head, but he pulled out his own phone and started recording. So did the woman in 3A and the couple in 5B and several other passengers who were beginning to realize that they were witnessing something that needed to be documented. Half the first-class cabin was now recording Captain Harrison's meltdown from different angles, creating a comprehensive video record that would make it impossible for anyone to later claim that the passenger had been the aggressor. Dr. Williams watched the phones multiplying with calm satisfaction. Documentation was always important, but it was especially crucial when dealing with people who confused authority with intimidation. "Captain," she said, her voice cutting through his ranting with quiet authority, "I'm going to give you one chance to walk back into that cockpit, complete your pre-flight procedures, and fly us safely to Miami. If you do that, we can discuss your behavior through proper channels after we land." She paused, letting the offer hang in the air like a lifeline that he could choose to grab or ignore. "If you continue this tantrum, if you persist in abusing your authority to humiliate passengers who haven't done anything wrong, you are going to regret it for the rest of your very short remaining career." The word tantrum applied to his professional behavior by a passenger hit Captain Harrison like a physical blow. His face turned a shade of purple that probably warranted medical attention. "Tantrum," he repeated, his voice rising to a near shout. "You call my legitimate exercise of authority a tantrum." At that moment, heavy footsteps echoed from the jet bridge. Two large men in high-visibility security vests walked onto the aircraft, followed by Elena Martinez, the gate agent who had been dealing with weather delays all day and was now being called to handle whatever crisis was unfolding in first class. "What's the situation?" Captain asked the first security officer. His name tag read M. Santos, and he had the weathered face of someone who had dealt with difficult passengers, unruly crews, and airport emergencies for most of his adult life. Captain Harrison pointed a trembling finger at Dr. Williams. "Seat 1. He said, his voice hoarse from shouting. "She's a security risk. She threatened crew safety. She refused direct orders from flight personnel. She's been disruptive and hostile since the moment she boarded this aircraft." Miguel Santos looked at the passenger in question. He saw a well-dressed woman sitting calmly in first class holding a notebook and pen. She wasn't yelling, wasn't moving around the cabin, wasn't bothering anyone. Her posture was relaxed, her expression was composed, and she radiated the kind of quiet confidence that came from someone who was completely comfortable with whatever was about to happen next. Then he looked at Captain Harrison. The pilot was sweating, red-faced, gesticulating wildly. His voice was hoarse from shouting. His uniform was disheveled. He looked like a man who was having some kind of breakdown in front of 300 passengers. In Miguel's 15 years of airport security, he had developed a pretty good sense for reading people, for distinguishing real problems from false alarms. Something about this situation felt very, very wrong. Miguel Santos had been in security long enough to know that the person doing the most yelling was usually the source of the problem, not the victim of it. But he also knew that airline captains had ultimate authority over their aircraft, and if Captain Harrison insisted that a passenger posed a security threat, Miguel was obligated to take that seriously, even when his instincts told him otherwise. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "did you refuse to follow crew instructions?" "I was finishing a business call when the captain approached me," Dr. Williams explained with perfect composure. "I ended the call when he asked me to. He then spent the next 15 minutes yelling at me for reasons I still don't understand." "She's lying," Harrison shouted, pointing at her with a shaking finger. "She called me emotionally unstable. She threatened to sue the airline. She's been nothing but hostile and disruptive since she sat down." Miguel looked around the first-class cabin. Multiple passengers were recording the interaction. Several people were shaking their heads in disagreement with the captain's version of events. The child in seat 3B was looking at Captain Harrison with the kind of frightened confusion that children show when adults behave badly. Most tellingly, the flight attendant standing behind the captain looked like she was about to cry. Rosa's face was pale. Her hands were shaking, and she kept glancing apologetically at the passenger as if she knew this entire situation was wrong, but didn't have the power to stop it. Elena Martinez was standing behind the security officers, looking increasingly uncomfortable as she scrolled through information on her tablet. Something had been nagging at her since she'd seen Dr. Williams's boarding pass, and now the feeling was getting stronger. The VIP notation in the reservation system, the special handling codes, the kind of passenger flagging that usually meant one of three things: celebrity government official or major airline executive. "Ma'am," Miguel said apologetically, "if the captain insists you need to deplane, we have to ask you to gather your belongings and come with us. You can sort this out with customer service on the ground." Captain Harrison smiled for the first time since the confrontation began. It was a cold, triumphant expression that revealed exactly how much he was enjoying this moment of vindicated authority. Finally, he said some respect for proper procedures and chain of command. Dr. Williams looked at Miguel Santos with something that might have been sympathy. "Officer, I understand you're just doing your job. But before we proceed, I have one question for Captain Harrison." She stood up, smoothing the front of her cashmere sweater. At 5 feet 8 inches in her heels, she was nearly as tall as the captain. She moved with the fluid grace of someone who was completely comfortable in her own skin, completely confident in her own power. "Captain Harrison, she said you've made quite a speech about authority and respect. You've told me that this is your aircraft, that your word is law, that passengers should defer to your judgment without question." Harrison was still smiling, still basking in what he believed was his moment of complete victory. "That's exactly right," he said. "About time someone understood how things work up here." Dr. Williams leaned slightly closer to him, not close enough to be threatening, but close enough that her next words would be absolutely clear. "But you forgot to ask one very important question before you started this little power display," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying the weight of absolute certainty. What question? Harrison asked, though something in her tone was making his stomach clench with sudden unease. "Doctor." Williams smiled, and it was the kind of expression that corporate executives wear when they're about to deliver news that will change someone's life forever. "You forgot to ask whose airline this actually is." The words hung in the air like a bomb with a slowly burning fuse. Harrison's smile faltered. Miguel Santos frowned. Elena Martinez, who had been scrolling through passenger information on her tablet, suddenly stopped breathing entirely. Dr. Williams stepped past Captain Harrison, her head held high, and walked toward the aircraft door with the measured pace of someone who had all the time in the world. She didn't look back. She didn't argue. She didn't make a scene. She simply left Captain Harrison to enjoy what would be the last moment of triumph in his entire aviation career. As she reached the door, she paused and looked back one more time. Not at Harrison, but at Rosa, who was still standing by the galley with tears in her eyes. "Rosa," she said gently, "this isn't your fault, but it is about to be someone's very expensive mistake." Elena Martinez watched Dr. Williams walk up the jet bridge, and the nagging feeling in her gut suddenly exploded into full-blown panic. She fumbled with her tablet, pulling up the detailed passenger manifest that she should have checked more carefully during boarding. Dr. Z. Williams, CEO. Horizon Aviation Holdings. Board member notation. Ownership stake 73%. The tablet slipped from her numb fingers and clattered to the floor, the screen cracking on impact. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God." Miguel Santos turned around at the sound of her distress. "Elena, what's wrong?" Elena was staring at the cracked screen of her tablet, her face white as paper, her hands shaking uncontrollably. The passenger she managed to croak. "The woman we just removed. What about her?" Miguel asked. Elena held up the tablet so he could see the information displayed on the damaged screen. "She's not just a passenger," Elena whispered, her voice barely audible. "She's the CEO of Horizon Aviation Holdings. She owns our airline. She owns everything. We just kicked our boss off her own airplane." Miguel Santos felt the blood drain from his face. He looked at the jet bridge where Dr. Williams had disappeared, then back at Captain Harrison, who was still standing in the cabin looking pleased with himself. Captain Miguel said slowly, "I think we might have a problem." "What kind of problem?" Harrison asked, his voice still carrying the arrogant confidence of someone who believed he had just successfully demonstrated his authority. Elena Martinez picked up her cracked tablet with trembling hands. "The kind of problem," she said, her voice getting stronger as the full magnitude of the situation became clear, where the person you just humiliated and had removed from the aircraft signs your paychecks and controls your pension plan. Captain Harrison's face went from triumphant red to sickly white in the space of a single heartbeat. In seat 3, B. Lily Patel watched this adult conversation with the kind of fascination that children bring to watching grown-ups realize they've made terrible mistakes. "Janet," she whispered to her escort, "I think the pilot is in really big trouble now." Janet nodded grimly. In her 12 years of working with airlines, she had never seen anything quite like this situation, but she had a feeling that Captain Harrison was about to learn some very expensive lessons about the difference between authority and accountability. Doctor. Zara Williams walked up the jet bridge with the steady rhythm of someone who had just set a sequence of events in motion that could not be stopped, slowed down, or redirected. Her heels clicked on the metal flooring like a countdown timer, each step bringing Captain Harrison's career closer to its inevitable end. The November cold bit at her face as she emerged into the terminal, but she felt nothing except the slow burn of carefully controlled fury. She had dealt with difficult men her entire professional life, men who confused volume with authority and aggression with leadership. Usually she chose her battles carefully, saving her energy for conflicts that actually mattered. This time was different. This time the battle had chosen her. Miguel Santos and his partner flanked her awkwardly as they walked toward the gate area. They had expected resistance arguments, maybe even tears. Instead, they were escorting the calmest person they had ever removed from an aircraft, a woman who seemed to be exactly where she wanted to be. Ma'am Miguel said as they reached the gate seating area, "I really am sorry about this situation. We can help you get rebooked on the next flight to Miami or maybe connect you through Atlanta or Charlotte." "That won't be necessary," Dr. Williams said, pulling out her phone. "But I appreciate your professionalism. You were just doing your job." Elena Martinez was practically jogging to keep up with them, her tablet clutched against her chest like a shield that might protect her from the career catastrophe she could see approaching. The VIP notation, the special handling codes, the ownership information she should have noticed during boarding. It was all there in the system, flagged and documented and completely ignored during the chaos of weather delays. She stopped walking. Her hands shook as she pulled up the detailed passenger information that would have prevented this entire disaster if she had bothered to read it 4 hours earlier. Dr. Z. Williams, Chief Executive Officer, Horizon Aviation Holdings. Board member, ownership stake 73%. Elena's knees gave out. She sank into one of the gate area chairs, staring at the screen with the kind of horrified fascination that people usually reserve for natural disasters or traffic accidents. "Oh, God," she whispered to herself. "She owns us. She literally owns the entire airline, and we just threw her off her own airplane because a pilot was having a temper tantrum." Meanwhile, back on Flight 2156, Captain Harrison was finally beginning to understand that something had gone very wrong with his moment of triumphant authority. The passengers were staring at him with expressions that ranged from disgust to pity. His crew members looked terrified, and Miguel Santos's partner, who had stayed behind to help sort out the situation, was speaking quietly into his radio with an urgency that suggested this was more than just another difficult passenger incident. Captain Harrison, the security officer, said, "I think you need to step off the aircraft. There's been a development." Harrison's arrogance was finally cracking around the edges. "What kind of development? I removed a disruptive passenger using proper procedures. What else is there to discuss?" First Officer Amy Chin emerged from the cockpit, her face pale and her hands shaking slightly. She had been monitoring company radio frequencies and had heard enough chatter to know that Flight 2156 had become the center of attention for airline management, airport operations, and possibly federal aviation authorities. "Captain," she said quietly, "I think we need to talk. Right now." But before Harrison could respond, Rose's galley phone rang with the distinctive tone that indicated a priority call from airline operations. She answered it automatically, then immediately held the handset away from her ear, as if it had become too hot to touch. "Captain Harrison," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Operations wants to speak with you." "Immediately." Harrison grabbed the phone with the kind of irritated confidence that suggested he expected to be commended for his decisive handling of a security situation. "This is Captain Harrison," he said. I hope you're calling to congratulate me on identifying and removing a disruptive passenger before she could create a real safety issue. The voice on the other end of the line was cold-clipped and absolutely furious. Captain Harrison, this is Patricia Moore, Director of Flight Operations. You are hereby ordered to step off that aircraft immediately. Do not speak to passengers. Do not speak to crew members. Do not speak to anyone until you are met by company representatives and legal counsel. Harrison's face went through several color changes as the implications of what he was hearing began to penetrate his consciousness. I don't understand, he said. What legal counsel? I followed proper procedures for removing a disruptive passenger. What's the problem? The problem, Captain Harrison, is that the passenger you just had removed owns 73% of this airline. Dr. Zara Williams is the CEO of Horizon Aviation Holdings. She signs my paycheck, she approves your salary, and she just watched you abuse your authority to humiliate her in front of 300 witnesses. The phone slipped from Harrison's suddenly nerveless fingers and clattered to the galley floor. In seat 3B, Lily Patel had been watching this entire sequence of events with the kind of absorbed attention that children bring to adult drama they don't fully understand but know is important. Janet, she said to her escort, is the pilot in trouble now? Janet nodded grimly. I think the pilot is in more trouble than he can possibly imagine, sweetheart. Lily considered this information with the serious expression that children wear when they're processing complex moral situations. Good, she said finally. He was mean to the nice lady for no reason. My mommy says when you're mean to people, you have to face consequences. Out of the mouths of babes, as the old saying goes. Sometimes the simplest moral clarity comes from the youngest voices from people who haven't yet learned to make excuses for inexcusable behavior. Trevor Walsh, who had been recording everything from Seat 4C, was watching his video explode across social media platforms in real time. The view count was climbing rapidly as people shared what they were calling the most spectacular airline meltdown ever captured on camera. Comments were flooding in faster than he could read them. This pilot is about to lose everything. That passenger handled this with incredible grace. I would pay money to see his face when he realizes who she is. This is why you treat everyone with respect. Career-ending mistake in real time. The hashtag respect at every altitude was already trending, and aviation industry blogs were picking up the story. This was no longer just an incident on one airplane. This was becoming a case study in corporate accountability, workplace respect, and the consequences of abusing authority. Captain Brett Harrison stood in the first-class cabin of Flight 2156, surrounded by the wreckage of his 26-year career, finally beginning to understand that sometimes the people you choose to humiliate have the power to ensure you never get the chance to humiliate anyone again. The storm outside was still raging, but the real storm was just beginning for everyone involved in what would become known as the most expensive temper tantrum in aviation history. Dr. Zara Williams stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows of Denver International Airport, watching snow swirl across the tarmac while she made the phone calls that would change the trajectory of multiple careers and possibly the entire aviation industry. The terminal around her buzzed with delayed passengers and frustrated travelers, but she might as well have been standing in her own private office for all the attention she paid to the chaos. Her first call was to Sarah Chen, who answered on the second ring, despite the fact that it was past midnight in Miami. Sarah, I need you on the next available flight to Denver. Bring Marcus from legal, bring the employment termination documents, and bring the crisis management team. We have a situation that requires immediate executive intervention. Sarah Chen had worked with Dr. Williams for 8 years, long enough to recognize the tone of voice that meant someone had made a very expensive mistake that would require careful strategic response. What kind of situation, Sarah asked, though she was already pulling up flight schedules on her laptop. The kind where one of our captains just committed career suicide by abusing a passenger he assumed was powerless. Dr. Williams replied. The entire incident was recorded by multiple passengers and is already going viral on social media. By the time you land in Denver, this will be a national news story." Sarah was quiet for a moment, processing the implications. "How bad are we talking?" "Bad enough that I was personally removed from one of our own aircraft by airport security while our captain celebrated his demonstration of authority," Dr. Williams said. "Bad enough that we're going to need to make some very public, very decisive changes to ensure this never happens again." Her second call was to Robert Hayes, the station manager at Denver International, who was in his office trying to coordinate weather-related delays when his assistant burst through the door with a look of absolute panic. "Mr. Hayes," the assistant gasped. "There's an emergency at gate C-22. Dr. Williams is asking to speak with you immediately." Robert dropped his coffee mug, sending hot liquid splashing across his desk and onto the floor. Dr. Zara Williams was not just another passenger complaint. She was the owner of his airline, the person who signed his paychecks and controlled his future employment prospects. He was running toward gate C-22 before his assistant finished explaining the situation, his mind racing through possible scenarios, and none of them ending well for his career. Dr. Williams's third call was to Arthur Penn in London, where it was now early morning and the merger documentation was waiting for final approval. "Arthur, I need you to record this conversation for legal documentation purposes. In the next few hours, I'm going to be making some personnel decisions that may require evidence of hostile workplace conditions and employee misconduct." Evidence for what Arthur asked, though he was already activating the recording features on his secure business phone. Evidence that one of our captains just provided the most spectacular demonstration of why corporate accountability and workplace respect training aren't optional suggestions, Dr. Williams replied. "Evidence that will support the most comprehensive culture transformation this industry has ever seen." Back on Flight 2156. The atmosphere had shifted from tense confrontation to something approaching panic among the crew members. Rosa Valdez was crying quietly in the galley, knowing that she had failed to protect a passenger from abuse, but also knowing that challenging Captain Harrison's authority could have cost her the job she desperately needed. Amy Chen was in the cockpit monitoring company radio frequencies, where Flight 2156 had become the center of urgent conversations between operations management, legal departments, and executive leadership. She could hear fragments of discussions about immediate investigation, Federal Aviation Authority notification, and emergency personnel actions. Captain Harrison was still in a state of stunned denial, pacing the first-class cabin like a trapped animal, while passengers watched him with mixtures of disgust, pity, and horrified fascination. Trevor Walsh's video had already reached 100,000 views and was being shared across every social media platform by people who recognized it as a perfect example of authority abuse and instant karma. The comments section was exploding with reactions. "This is the most satisfying comeuppance I've ever seen. That woman handled herself with such grace and dignity. The pilot had no idea he was destroying his own career. I hope she owns the airline and fires everyone who supported this. Plot twist, she actually does own the airline." Miguel Santos was radioing his supervisor, trying to explain a situation that seemed to get more complicated every time he attempted to describe it. "We removed a first-class passenger at the captain's insistence, but now we're getting information that she might be a major airline executive, possibly an owner. This could be a significant incident." Elena Martinez was still sitting in the gate area, staring at her cracked tablet screen and the passenger information that should have prevented this entire disaster. VIP status codes, ownership documentation, executive contact information. All of it right there in the system. All of it completely ignored during the chaos of weather delays and frustrated passengers. She pulled out her personal cell phone and started scrolling through social media, looking for more information about Dr. Zara Williams. What she found made her stomach drop even further. Forbes articles about Williams' rise from aerospace engineer to airline mogul, Businessweek profiles describing her as the most powerful woman in commercial aviation. Harvard Business Review case studies analyzing her company's innovative approaches to customer service and employee satisfaction. This wasn't just the CEO of a small regional airline. This was one of the most influential executives in the entire transportation industry, a woman whose company controlled billions of dollars in assets and employed thousands of people across multiple countries. And they had just thrown her off her own airplane because a pilot with anger management issues had decided she wasn't showing him enough respect. Robert Hayes arrived at Gate C-22 out of breath and sweating through his dress shirt despite the air conditioning. He spotted Dr. Williams immediately standing near the windows with her phone pressed to her ear, looking calm and composed and absolutely terrifying in her quiet authority. "Dr. Williams," he gasped as he approached. "I came as soon as I heard. This is absolutely unacceptable. I want to apologize on behalf of the entire Denver operation." Dr. Williams ended her call and turned to face him with the kind of expression that senior executives wear when they're about to deliver consequences that will reshape someone's understanding of accountability. "Mr. Hayes," she said, "I appreciate you coming quickly. Now, I need you to demonstrate exactly how seriously Horizon Aviation takes passenger safety and crew misconduct." She gestured toward the aircraft where Captain Harrison was still visible through the windows, still pacing the first-class cabin in his uniform that no longer represented authority, but had become evidence of abuse of power. "I need Captain Harrison removed from that aircraft immediately. I need the full passenger manifest with contact information for witnesses. I need security footage from the gate area and the jet bridge, and I need all of it documented and preserved for legal proceedings." Robert nodded frantically, knowing that his job depended on handling this situation perfectly. "Absolutely, Dr. Williams. Whatever you need. But if we remove Captain Harrison now, we'll have to cancel the flight. 300 passengers will be stranded by the weather." Dr. Williams smiled, and it was not a warm expression. "Robert, those 300 passengers just witnessed an airline captain abuse his authority to humiliate someone he assumed was powerless. Do you really think they want that man flying their airplane?" The next 20 minutes would be studied in business schools for decades as a masterclass in swift, decisive leadership and the consequences of allowing toxic behavior to flourish in positions of authority. Dr. Williams had spent her career building systems and structures designed to prevent exactly the kind of abuse she had just experienced, but she had never expected to become a test case for her own corporate policies. Airport police officers returned to Flight 2156 this time, accompanied by Robert Hayes, Elena Martinez, and 2 representatives from airline operations who looked like they were attending their own funeral. The passengers who were still recording captured every moment as this parade of authority figures walked down the jet bridge toward what everyone could sense would be a career-ending confrontation. Captain Harrison was still in the first-class cabin, but his demeanor had changed dramatically in the past 10 minutes. The radio conversations, the urgent phone calls, the suddenly serious expressions on everyone's faces had finally penetrated his wall of righteous indignation. He was beginning to understand that this situation was bigger than a simple passenger complaint, more serious than anything his 26 years of experience had prepared him to handle. "Captain Harrison," Robert Hayes said as he boarded the aircraft, his voice shaking slightly. "I need you to step off this aircraft immediately. There's been a development regarding the passenger you had removed." Harrison's laugh was forced and hollow. "What kind of development?" She filed a complaint already. That was fast even for an entitled passenger with too much time on her hands. The airport police officers exchanged glances. The older one, Sergeant Rodriguez, had been doing this job long enough to recognize when someone was about to have their entire world collapse around them. Sir Rodriguez said carefully, "We need you to come with us. There are some questions about the incident that need to be addressed by airline management and potentially federal aviation authorities." Before Harrison could respond, Sarah Chen appeared in the aircraft doorway. Sarah was Horizon Aviation's Vice President of Operations, a woman who commanded respect in boardrooms across the aviation industry and was known for her ability to solve complex operational problems with surgical precision and zero tolerance for incompetence. She had caught the last flight out of Miami, worked through detailed briefing materials during the flight, and arrived at Denver International with a complete understanding of the legal, operational, and public relations catastrophe that Captain Harrison had created. "Captain Harrison," she said, stepping into the cabin with the kind of commanding presence that fills a room, "please step off this aircraft immediately. We need to discuss your employment status." Harrison blinked in recognition. Sarah Chen was several levels above him in the corporate hierarchy, someone who reported directly to the executive team and had the authority to make career-defining decisions about airline personnel. "Ms. Chen, what are you doing here? I thought you were based in Miami. If this is about that passenger, I can explain everything." She was being disruptive, refusing crew instructions, creating a safety hazard. Sarah looked at him for a long moment, and Harrison could see something like pity in her expression. "Captain, do you know who Dr. Zara Williams is? Some entitled passenger with an attitude problem," Harrison replied, but his voice was getting smaller and less certain with each word. "Dr. Zara Williams is the Chief Executive Officer and majority owner of Horizon Aviation Holdings," Sarah said, letting each word land like a physical blow. "She owns 73% of this airline, Captain. She signs our paychecks. She approves our operational budgets. She sits on our board of directors." The color drained from Harrison's face so rapidly that Sergeant Rodriguez instinctively stepped forward, thinking the man might collapse. "She controls your salary, your benefits, your pension plan, and your future employment prospects," Sarah continued relentlessly. "The woman you just humiliated and had removed from this aircraft is your boss's boss's boss." Harrison's knees buckled slightly. He grabbed the back of a passenger seat to steady himself, his mind struggling to process information that seemed impossible to believe. That can't be. She was on her phone arguing with me, calling me emotionally unstable. She was conducting critical business for a multi-billion-dollar merger that secures the jobs of 3,000 employees, Sarah said. "Business that you interrupted because you didn't like her tone of voice." At that moment, Dr. Williams herself appeared in the aircraft doorway. She moved with the same calm dignity she had shown throughout the confrontation, but now there was something different in her demeanor. Not anger, exactly. Something colder and more dangerous. The passengers who were still on board erupted into spontaneous applause. The businessman in 4A stood up and started clapping. The woman in 3A whistled appreciatively. Even some passengers from economy who had crowded forward to watch were applauding. Lily Patel, who had been watching this adult drama unfold with fascination, clapped her small hands together and said in a clear voice that carried throughout the cabin, "The nice lady is back. Now the mean pilot has to say sorry, Doctor." Williams raised her hand for silence, and the cabin immediately went quiet. When she spoke, her voice carried to every corner of the aircraft. "Captain Harrison, you made several speeches today about authority and respect. You told me that on your aircraft, your word is law. You demanded that I listen when you speak and follow your orders without question." She took a step closer to him, and Harrison involuntarily stepped backward. "But here's what you failed to understand during your impressive display of authority. This isn't your aircraft, Captain. It's mine. These aren't your passengers. They're mine. This uniform you're so proud of, this salary you collect every month, this pension plan you're counting on for retirement, all of it belongs to me." Harrison's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. He looked like a man drowning in deep water with no idea how to swim. More importantly, Dr. Williams continued, "You revealed your true character today, when you thought I was just another passenger, someone you perceived as powerless. Someone you could intimidate without consequences. You showed everyone exactly who you are." She gestured toward the cabin around them, toward the passengers who were still recording, toward the crew members who had watched the entire confrontation unfold. "You're a bully, Captain Harrison. You use your uniform and your authority to humiliate people you think can't fight back. You abuse your position to satisfy your own ego at the expense of passenger dignity and crew member safety." Trevor Walsh's live stream had reached 200,000 viewers. The comments were flooding in faster than anyone could read them, but the sentiment was unanimous. Justice was finally being served, and people were here for every moment of it. Harrison was trembling now, whether from shock, rage, or terror, no one could tell. "Dr. Williams," he said, his voice cracking like an adolescent's, "if I had known who you were." That's exactly the problem. Dr. Williams cut him off. "If you had known who I was, you would have been respectful. You would have been professional. You would have treated me like a human being worthy of basic dignity." She paused, letting that reality sink in. "But because you thought I was just another passenger, someone without power or influence, you felt free to abuse your authority. You felt entitled to humiliate me in front of other people. That tells me everything I need to know about your character, Captain." The cabin was so quiet that people could hear the snow hitting the windows outside. Miss Chen, Dr. Williams said, turning to the Vice President of Operations, "Captain Harrison is no longer employed by Horizon Aviation. Please have security escort him from the aircraft." What happened next would be replayed on social media millions of times, analyzed by leadership experts and used in corporate training programs as an example of how accountability and consequences actually work when applied properly and without regard for traditional hierarchies or professional relationships. Captain Brett Harrison made one last desperate attempt to salvage a situation that had already moved far beyond salvage and into the realm of career-ending catastrophe. "Dr. Williams, please," he said, his voice breaking with something that might have been panic. "I have 26 years with this company. I have a mortgage, a pension that's supposed to vest in 4 years. I made a mistake, yes, but it was just a misunderstanding. I never meant to." "You made a choice," Dr. Williams said firmly, her voice cutting through his pleading with surgical precision. "Every word you spoke was a choice. Every threat you made was a choice. Every moment you spent trying to intimidate me was a deliberate decision on your part." She looked around the cabin, making eye contact with the passengers who had witnessed the entire confrontation, the crew members who had been forced to participate in it, and the security personnel who had been called to enforce it. This wasn't a moment of poor judgment or a single lapse in professionalism. This was a pattern of behavior, a demonstration of character, a window into how you treat people when you think there will be no consequences. Rosa Valdez, who had been standing near the galley trying to make herself invisible, found herself stepping forward despite her fear of getting involved in management decisions that were way above her pay grade. "Dr. Williams," she said quietly, "I want to apologize for my role in what happened. I should have stood up to him. I should have refused to call security. I knew it was wrong, but I was afraid of losing my job." "Doctor." Williams turned to look at Rosa with an expression that was both understanding and disappointed. "Rosa, you were put in an impossible position. You were ordered by your captain to participate in something you knew was wrong, but you feared the consequences of standing up to him. That fear tells me everything I need to know about the culture that allowed this situation to develop." She gestured to Sarah Chen, who had been taking notes throughout the entire exchange. "Sarah, effective immediately. Rosa is promoted to Director of Crew Advocacy. Her job will be to ensure that no flight attendant, gate agent, or ground crew member ever again feels too afraid to do what's right, because they're worried about retaliation from management." The applause that followed was spontaneous and heartfelt. Rosa burst into tears, but they were tears of relief and gratitude rather than fear and shame. "Doctor." Williams then turned to Amy Chen, who had been watching from the cockpit doorway with the kind of fascination that people usually reserve for natural disasters or historical events. First Officer Chen. Are you qualified to captain this aircraft? Amy straightened up, her voice stronger and more confident than it had been all day. Yes, ma'am. I'm fully certified on this equipment and have over 3,000 hours of flight time. Then congratulations, Captain Chen. You just received a field promotion based on merit competence and the demonstrated ability to maintain professionalism under pressure. The applause was even louder this time. Amy's promotion represented more than just an individual advancement. It symbolized a fundamental shift in how the airline would evaluate and reward its personnel. Dr. Williams looked at Captain Harrison one final time. He was still standing near the galley, supported by the back of a passenger seat, looking like a man who had just watched his entire life collapse in the span of 30 minutes. Captain Harrison, or rather former Captain Harrison, I want you to understand something very important. This isn't about revenge or personal satisfaction. This is about accountability and consequences and the kind of culture we choose to create and maintain. She paused, making sure her words were being recorded by the multiple devices still documenting the conversation. You had the authority to remove me from this aircraft, and you chose to exercise that authority in the most humiliating way possible. Now, I have the authority to remove you from this company, and I'm exercising that authority in front of the same witnesses who watched you abuse yours. Harrison opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. What was there to say? What argument could he make? What excuse could possibly justify the choices he had made? Dr. Williams continued speaking, but now she was addressing the entire cabin, speaking to the passengers who had witnessed this confrontation and the broader audience that would see it online. Real authority isn't something you demand from other people. It's something you earn through competence, integrity, and respect for human dignity. Real leadership isn't about using your position to diminish others. It's about using your platform to elevate them. Lily Patel, who had been watching this entire exchange with the kind of absorbed attention that children bring to moral lessons they recognize as important, raised her small hand. Dr. Williams, she said in her clear 8-year-old voice, my daddy says that being in charge means taking care of people, not being mean to them. Is that what you're doing, Doctor? Williams smiled, and for the first time since this confrontation began, it was a warm, genuine expression. That's exactly what I'm doing, sweetheart. Being in charge means making sure everyone feels safe and respected no matter who they are or what they look like or how much money they have. She looked around the cabin one more time. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this disruption. What you witnessed today was completely unacceptable, and I promise you it will never happen again on any aircraft in our fleet. Harrison was escorted off the aircraft by airport police, his 26-year career ending with the same kind of public humiliation he had tried to inflict on a passenger who was guilty of nothing more than conducting business on her own airline. As he walked up the jet bridge past the same windows where Dr. Williams had been forced to walk 30 minutes earlier, he could see the judgment in people's eyes, could feel the weight of his choices settling on his shoulders like a heavy coat he would never be able to take off. Trevor Walsh's video had reached 500,000 views and was trending on every social media platform. The story was being picked up by major news outlets, aviation industry publications, and corporate leadership blogs. But the most powerful moment wasn't captured by any camera or recorded by any device. It was the sight of Dr. Zara Williams settling back into seat 1A, opening her notebook and calmly resuming the business call that had started this entire confrontation. Arthur, she said into her phone as if nothing had happened, sorry for the delay. Now about those European Union regulations and the documentation timeline for the merger approval. Justice, as it turned out, was best served at 35,000 feet, with dignity intact, and accountability enforced through the simple application of consequences to choices that had gone unchallenged for far too long. The transformation of Flight 2156 was immediate, profound, and unlike anything the veteran flight attendants had ever experienced in their combined decades of commercial aviation. What had been a tense, uncomfortable cabin filled with passengers witnessing workplace abuse suddenly became something entirely different. A flying classroom in corporate accountability leadership under pressure and the power of standing up for what's right. Captain Amy Chen, newly promoted and still processing the surreal circumstances that had led to her first command, completed her pre-flight checks with methodical precision. At 26, she had never expected to receive a field promotion under these conditions, but she was determined to prove worthy of Dr. Williams's confidence. Denver, ground. "This is Horizon 2156, requesting taxi clearance," she said into her headset, her voice steady and professional despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "Horizon 2156, cleared to taxi, runway 25 left, and congratulations on the promotion. Captain Chen." "We heard about the situation over the radio." The story had already spread throughout Denver International Airport faster than wildfire through dry grass. Ground control gate agents and airport operations all knew what had happened. In an industry where stories traveled at the speed of light through crew lounges and operations centers, this was already becoming the stuff of legend. Rosa Valdez, still wearing her new Director of Crew Advocacy pin that Sarah Chen had given her, addressed the cabin with a confidence and authority she had never felt before. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we take off, I want to personally address what you witnessed today. What happened was a complete failure of leadership and professionalism. It was wrong, it was inexcusable, and it will never happen again." She gestured toward a laminated card she was holding, something that hadn't existed an hour earlier but had been created in real time as part of Dr. Williams's immediate response to the crisis. Every crew member on every Horizon aviation flight now carries a direct anonymous reporting channel to our executive team. Any employee who witnesses inappropriate behavior from anyone at any level of the company can report it without fear of retaliation. The applause was spontaneous and sustained. These weren't just passengers anymore. They were witnesses to a moment of corporate transformation happening in real time, and they recognized the historic nature of what they were seeing. Dr. Williams stood and addressed the cabin, her voice carrying the same calm authority that had remained unshaken throughout Captain Harrison's meltdown. "What you saw today was one person's failure to understand the difference between authority and intimidation. Real leadership isn't about demanding respect through fear. It's about earning respect through competence, integrity, and treating every person with the dignity they deserve." Trevor Walsh, who was still recording from seat 4C, raised his hand. His video had now reached over 1 million views and was being shared across every social media platform by people who recognized it as a perfect example of accountability in action. Dr. Williams, as the person who captured this entire incident on video, "I want you to know that your response has restored my faith in corporate accountability. People need to see that there are consequences when authority is abused. Thank you, Trevor. Documentation and transparency are essential for real change. When people know their actions are being witnessed and recorded, they tend to make better choices." An elderly woman in seat 5A spoke up, her voice carrying the authority that comes from decades of life experience. "Dr. Williams, I've been flying for 60 years. I've seen passengers treated badly by crew members who thought their uniforms made them untouchable. What you did today sends a message to the entire industry." "That was exactly the intention," Dr. Williams replied. "Respect should never be conditional on someone's perceived status, their race, their gender, or their economic position. It should be universal, automatic, and non-negotiable." As the aircraft began its taxi toward the runway, the atmosphere in the cabin was unlike anything the crew had experienced in their careers. Passengers were talking to each other across aisles, sharing their own stories of workplace bullying, corporate abuse, and situations where they had wished someone with power had stood up for what was right. The traumatic incident had somehow bonded them into a temporary community of shared experience, united by witnessing a moment when accountability had been swift, decisive, and completely appropriate to the offense. Lily Patel, who had been watching all of this adult interaction with the kind of absorbed attention that children bring to moral lessons, unbuckled her seatbelt and walked over to Dr. Williams' seat. "Dr. Williams," she said in her clear 8-year-old voice. "Thank you for showing the grown-ups how to be nice to each other." Dr. Williams smiled and knelt down to Lily's eye level. "Sweetheart, you were very brave today, too. When you asked why the pilot was being mean, you reminded all the adults that sometimes the simplest questions are the most important ones." Lily nodded seriously. "My daddy says that people in uniforms should help people, not scare them. Is that why you had to fire the mean pilot?" "That's exactly why, honey. When people have important jobs, they have to use their power to protect others, not to hurt them." As Flight 2156 reached cruising altitude, Dr. Williams finally had the opportunity to complete her merger call with Arthur Penn. The European Union regulators, perhaps influenced by the positive press coverage that Horizon Aviation was suddenly receiving for its decisive response to workplace misconduct, had approved the deal with minimal additional conditions. "Arthur," she said, "I think our reputation for corporate responsibility just became one of our strongest business assets." "The financial markets are certainly responding positively," Arthur replied from London. "Stock price is up 12% since the video went viral. Apparently, investors like companies that demonstrate actual accountability rather than just talking about it." Sarah Chen, who had been working with the legal team to document every aspect of the incident for potential regulatory review, approached Dr. Williams with a preliminary report. "The passengers we've interviewed are all consistent in their accounts. Captain Harrison was completely out of line. His behavior was unprofessional and potentially discriminatory, and your response was measured and appropriate." She paused, consulting her notes. "More importantly, we're getting inquiries from other airlines asking about our employee advocacy program, our accountability procedures, and our approaches to preventing workplace harassment. This incident is becoming a case study for the entire industry." Dr. Williams nodded, but her mind was already moving beyond this specific situation to the broader implications and opportunities it represented. "Sarah, I want you to schedule meetings with the other major airlines. If they're interested in learning from our approach, then we have an opportunity to influence industry-wide culture change rather than just fixing our own problems." As they approached Miami, the passengers spontaneously began applauding again. Not for the smooth flight or the crew service, but for the larger victory they had all witnessed, the victory of dignity over humiliation, accountability over impunity, and moral clarity over bureaucratic excuses. Dr. Williams stood to address them one final time. "When we land in Miami, you'll go back to your regular lives, but what happened today doesn't stay on this airplane. You've seen that change is possible, that bullies can be held accountable, and that one person standing up for what's right can inspire an entire organization to transform itself." She looked around the cabin, making eye contact with as many passengers as possible. "Take that knowledge with you. Use it in your own workplaces, your own communities, your own families. Be the person who speaks up when others are being mistreated. Be the person who refuses to let abuse masquerade as authority." The applause continued until the aircraft touched down in Miami, and passengers were already posting about their experience on social media platforms, where the hashtag #RespectAtEveryAltitude was beginning to trend worldwide. News crews were waiting at the gate, alerted by the viral video and the unprecedented story of in-flight corporate accountability that was already being called the most significant workplace culture incident in aviation history. But Dr. Williams wasn't interested in media interviews or publicity opportunities. She had work to do, systems to build, and an industry to transform. The real story wasn't the spectacular downfall of one abusive captain. It was the beginning of a comprehensive cultural revolution that would ensure this kind of abuse never happened again. 6 months later, the Horizon Aviation Training Center in Miami buzzed with an energy that would have been impossible before Flight 2156 became the most watched airline incident in social media history. The state-of-the-art facility, with its soaring glass walls and modern steel architecture, was packed with 200 new employees who represented something unprecedented in commercial aviation, a workforce trained from day one in the principles of dignity, respect, and accountability at every level. The auditorium was deliberately integrated. Pilots sat next to flight attendants, ground crew supervisors next to customer service representatives, maintenance technicians next to gate agents. In the old culture, these groups would have been segregated by hierarchy and department with invisible caste systems that kept everyone in their assigned social positions. Today was different. Today they sat together as equals, united by a shared commitment to treating every person, whether passenger, co-worker, or supervisor, with fundamental human respect. Dr. Zara Williams stood at the podium, illuminated by warm spotlights that made the company's new motto glow against the backdrop screen, "Dignity at every altitude." She didn't need notes. She had given variations of this speech dozens of times over the past 6 months, but each presentation felt as crucial as the first, because each new class of employees represented another step toward permanent cultural transformation. "Welcome to Horizon Aviation," she began, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the auditorium. "You are joining a company that learned the hard way that authority without accountability is just bullying with a uniform." A ripple of knowing laughter moved through the audience. Everyone here knew the story of Captain Harrison and Flight 2156. Trevor Walsh's video, now with over 15 million views, was required viewing for all new hires, used as a teaching tool about the consequences of workplace abuse and the importance of bystander intervention. 6 months ago, one of our captains believed that his rank gave him the right to humiliate passengers and intimidate crew members. Dr. Williams continued. He was wrong, and his mistake became a learning opportunity for our entire industry. Behind her, the screen displayed photos of employees at every level of the company, all wearing small silver pins that read, "Respect Advocate." This wasn't just symbolic jewelry. Each pin represented real authority to report misconduct, regardless of who committed it or what position they held. Every person at Horizon Aviation now has the power and responsibility to speak up when they witness inappropriate behavior, Dr. Williams explained. A first-day flight attendant can file a complaint against a 20-year captain. A baggage handler can report a gate supervisor. A customer service representative can challenge a district manager. She paused, letting the weight of that authority settle over the new employees. And when they do report misconduct, they will be protected, supported, and heard. Because we've learned that silence isn't loyalty, it's complicity in allowing abuse to continue. In the front row sat Rosa Valdez, no longer wearing a flight attendant uniform, but instead dressed in a sharp navy blazer with the silver pin that identified her as Director of Employee Advocacy. Her transformation from a frightened crew member afraid to challenge authority to a confident leader empowering others to speak up represented the kind of individual growth that Dr. Williams had hoped to inspire across the entire organization. Rosa had spent the past 6 months traveling to every Horizon Aviation base meeting with crew members who had their own stories of workplace harassment, bullying supervisors, and toxic managers who had hidden behind rank and seniority. The anonymous reporting system had received over 600 complaints in its first month, not because problems had gotten worse, but because people finally felt safe speaking up about issues that had been festering for years. 18 managers had been terminated for various forms of workplace misconduct. 27 others had undergone intensive retraining focused on leadership through respect rather than intimidation. An entire culture of fear-based management was being dismantled piece by piece, replaced by systems that rewarded competence, integrity, and the courage to do what was right. "We've implemented real-time feedback systems, Doctor." Williams continued clicking to display employee satisfaction scores that had skyrocketed over the past 6 months. Every flight now ends with anonymous crew evaluations that go directly to our executive team. Every passenger interaction is documented and reviewed. Every complaint is investigated by independent advocates who report directly to me. The next slide showed customer satisfaction ratings that had reached record highs, employee retention improvements that had exceeded industry benchmarks, and stock performance that had made Horizon Aviation one of the most valuable airlines in the world. It turns out Dr. Williams said with a genuine smile that treating people with dignity and respect is not only the right thing to do, it's extremely profitable. The applause was spontaneous and sustained. These weren't employees being forced to clap for their CEO. These were people who genuinely believed in the transformation they were witnessing and wanted to be part of continuing it. As Dr. Williams stepped away from the podium, Rosa approached the microphone and adjusted it to her height. 6 months ago, she had been too terrified to speak up when she witnessed passenger abuse. Today, she was addressing 200 new employees as a senior executive with real authority to create change. "My name is Rosa Valdez," she said, her voice steady and clear. 6 months ago, I watched a passenger get mistreated by a captain, and I said nothing because I was afraid of losing my job. She looked out at the sea of faces, many of them young people just starting their careers in aviation. Dr. Williams didn't just save that passenger from continued harassment. She saved me from a lifetime of moral cowardice. She showed me that real courage isn't the absence of fear, it's doing what's right despite being afraid. Rosa's voice grew stronger as she continued. Every person in this room will face a moment when you have to choose between staying safe by staying silent or speaking up for someone who's being mistreated. When that moment comes, I want you to remember that you are not alone. This company will stand behind you. This leadership will protect you. This culture will support you. The standing ovation that followed lasted nearly 10 minutes. Cell phone cameras captured the moment from dozens of angles, creating video clips that would be shared across social media and inspire similar accountability programs at companies across multiple industries. After the ceremony, Dr. Williams walked through the training facility, observing new programs that had grown directly out of the Flight 2156 incident. The Bystander Intervention Workshop taught employees how to safely support colleagues being mistreated. The Leadership Without Intimidation seminar showed managers how to maintain authority while respecting employee dignity. The Speak Up, Stand Up module gave everyone practical tools for reporting misconduct without fear of retaliation. In one classroom, she watched a role-playing exercise where a veteran captain was practicing how to handle passenger complaints without losing his temper. The trainer was a former flight attendant who had once been afraid to question anyone with more stripes on their uniform than she had. In another room, customer service representatives were learning de-escalation techniques that prioritized understanding over compliance, empathy over enforcement. They practiced phrases like, "Help me understand your concern," instead of "company policy doesn't allow that." It was a complete cultural revolution, implemented one conversation, one training session, one policy change at a time. The transformation that had begun with one passenger's refusal to be intimidated was now affecting thousands of employees and millions of passengers across the entire airline industry. 1 year after Flight 2156 became the most watched workplace accountability video in Internet history, Dr. Zara Williams found herself in Seat 1A again, this time on a competitor's airline flying from Los Angeles to New York for a conference on transportation industry leadership. She had deliberately chosen to fly with a different carrier to observe industry standards and see whether the changes that had started with Horizon Aviation were spreading to other companies. The answer became clear before the aircraft even pushed back from the gate. As passengers were settling into their seats, the captain emerged from the cockpit and approached her with the kind of respectful professionalism that she had hoped to inspire across the entire industry. "Excuse me," he said politely. "Are you Dr. Zara Williams?" She looked up, immediately alert, but not alarmed. The captain's tone was respectful. His body language was appropriate, and his approach was nothing like the aggressive confrontation she had experienced with Brett Harrison. "Yes, I am," she replied. "I wanted to thank you personally." The captain said, his voice filled with genuine gratitude. what you did on Flight 2156, the changes you implemented at Horizon Aviation, the example you set for our entire industry. It gave me the courage to report a serious problem in my own company." He paused, clearly moved by what he was about to share. "We had a supervisor who was creating a hostile work environment for female crew members. Sexual harassment, inappropriate comments, retaliation against anyone who complained. Because of your example, because you showed that accountability was possible even at the highest levels, I found the strength to document what was happening and report it to our executive team." Dr. Williams stood and shook his hand, recognizing the moral courage it had taken for him to speak up against workplace misconduct in his own organization. "What happened to the supervisor?" she asked. "Terminated immediately," the captain replied. "And our company implemented new reporting procedures, anonymous complaint systems, and mandatory respect training for all management personnel. Other crew members have told me they feel safer now, more supported, more confident that their concerns will be heard and addressed." He smiled, and Dr. Williams could see the relief in his expression. "My name is David Kim, by the way. I was promoted to captain after the situation was resolved. They said my willingness to speak up demonstrated the kind of leadership they wanted to reward." Dr. Williams smiled back, recognizing the irony. Captain Kim had found his courage by watching what happened to Captain Harrison, learning from both the negative example of abuse and the positive example of accountability. "Captain Kim, you didn't need my example to do what was right. That courage was already inside you. Sometimes we just need permission to use it." As Captain Kim returned to the cockpit and the aircraft prepared for departure, Dr. Williams reflected on the ripple effects that had spread far beyond her own company. The Flight 2156 video had been viewed over 50 million times across various platforms. It had been featured in business school case studies, corporate training programs, and leadership development seminars. More importantly, it had inspired thousands of employees across dozens of industries to speak up when they witnessed workplace abuse, discrimination, and harassment. The hashtag respect at every altitude had evolved into a broader movement for workplace dignity that extended far beyond the aviation industry. She opened her notebook and began writing her thoughts about the past year, the changes she had witnessed, and the work that still needed to be done. "Leadership isn't about commanding respect through fear," she wrote. "It's about earning respect through character. Authority isn't about the power to diminish others. It's about the responsibility to elevate them. Change doesn't come from grand gestures or corporate mission statements. It comes from ordinary people deciding they deserve better and having the courage to demand it." The flight to New York was smooth and professional. The crew was courteous and competent. The captain made periodic announcements that were informative without being condescending. It was exactly the kind of respectful, dignified air travel experience that Dr. Williams had been working to create across the entire industry. As they began their descent into New York, she received a text message from Sarah Chen with updates on Horizon Aviation's continued success. Customer satisfaction scores remained at record highs. Employee retention had improved by 60%. The company had been named one of the best places to work in transportation for the third consecutive quarter. More significantly, 12 other airlines had adopted similar accountability programs, anonymous reporting systems, and respect-based training protocols. The industry-wide transformation that had started with one passenger's refusal to be intimidated was now affecting millions of travelers and hundreds of thousands of employees. But the message that meant the most to Dr. Williams came from an unexpected source. Lily Patel, now 9 years old and still flying as an unaccompanied minor to visit her grandmother, had sent a hand-drawn card with a simple message: "Thank you for teaching the grown-ups how to be nice to each other. Love, Lily." The drawing showed an airplane with smiling passengers and crew members, everyone treating each other with kindness and respect. It was a child's vision of what air travel could be when adults remembered their responsibility to care for each other. Dr. Williams carefully placed the card in her notebook next to the original notes she had taken during Captain Harrison's meltdown. The contrast was stark from one man's failure to understand the difference between authority and accountability to a child's clear vision of how people should treat each other. As the plane touched down at JFK Airport, Dr. Williams thought about the conference she was attending the next day. She would be speaking to transportation executives from around the world about leadership corporate culture and the importance of creating workplaces where dignity wasn't optional but was the foundation of everything else. The little girl from Cleveland who had watched her mother endure disrespect with quiet strength had grown into a woman who refused to let dignity be negotiable. Flight 2156 had ended with one man's career in ruins and his victim vindicated, but the real victory wasn't in Harrison's downfall. The real victory was in the thousands of employees who now went to work every day knowing they were valued and protected. It was in the millions of passengers who flew on airlines that had learned to treat human dignity as their highest operational priority. It was in the industry-wide transformation that proved toxic cultures could be changed when someone with power decided to use that power for justice instead of dominance. The aircraft came to a stop at the gate and passengers began gathering their belongings for disembarkation. Dr. Williams remained seated for a moment, looking out the window at the busy airport where thousands of people were traveling to destinations around the world. Each of those travelers deserved to be treated with respect, regardless of their race, their economic status, their appearance, or their perceived importance. Each of those airline employees deserved to work in an environment where speaking up for what's right was supported rather than punished. The work was far from finished, but the foundation had been laid. One woman's refusal to accept abuse as normal had helped an entire industry learn to stand taller, speak up louder, and remember that real authority comes from serving others rather than diminishing them. As Dr. Williams gathered her things and prepared to leave the aircraft. She smiled at the knowledge that somewhere right now another passenger was being treated with dignity because someone had found the courage to say that abuse masquerading as authority was no longer acceptable. The flight had ended, but the journey toward universal workplace respect and accountability was just beginning. This story reminds us that respect doesn't require a title. Courage doesn't require permission. And change doesn't require waiting for someone else to start. Dr. Williams showed us that the most powerful response to sit down and be quiet is sometimes to stand up and speak truth with unshakable dignity. Have you ever witnessed someone abuse their authority because they thought their victim was powerless? Have you stayed silent when you should have spoken up or found the courage to stand up when others wouldn't? Share your story in the comments. Your experience might inspire someone else to find their voice. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories where justice wins and dignity matters. Because sometimes the people others choose to underestimate have exactly the power needed to ensure it never happens again.